Good evening. It's July the 15th, 1969. The clock is ticking. The final countdown has already begun. Soon, man's greatest adventure, the journey to the moon, will begin. This is the scene at the Kennedy Space Center tonight. Final preparations are being made for liftoff, and every moment counts. It was back in 1961 that President John F. Kennedy vowed to make the United States the first nation to put a man on the moon. Now NASA is tantalizingly close to achieving his goal. Over the next few nights, if all goes according to plan, history will be made. And you can join us for a front row seat. Peter Snow is here to explain the technology behind this extraordinary project. But first, our Apollo correspondent, Andrea Catherwood, reports on the moon mission and the men on the verge of making the dream a reality.
The Kennedy Space Center in Florida is at the heart of America's journey into the unknown. Astronauts, engineers and scientists all working together to find a way to achieve a daring dream.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
3 men have been chosen, risking their lives to meet that challenge. Commander Neil Armstrong could become the first person to set foot on the moon. Edwin Buzz Aldrin is also moonbound. And finally, Michael Collins. The 3 astronauts must rely on the most complex space technology ever to help them reach their goal. But despite all the tests, there will only be one way to find out if it really works. The Saturn V rocket, truly an astonishing feat of engineering, will power them into orbit. And the Apollo 11 spacecraft will be their home as they fly to the moon. Each stage of their mission has been planned with a meticulous eye. NASA has tried to foresee every danger, every challenge ahead. The 2 astronauts who will go to the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin, have had extra training. They've learned to fly the spacecraft, which they hope will take them to the lunar surface and return them safely again. They simply don't know what they'll find if they get there. So they've tried to anticipate the unexpected, learning how to move around in low gravity, collect rock samples and even set up a camera which will film live pictures of the moonwalk and beam them back to Earth. Now all the planning is complete, all the training is over, and NASA and its astronauts know their toughest test is still ahead.
So the Apollo 11 mission is ready to fly, the culmination of years of work aimed at getting man on the moon. Here's Peter Snow to take a closer look at the rocket which will carry the astronauts into orbit and beyond.
Man has always looked to the skies, John, but for thousands of years the study of space was an earthbound affair. Now that's changed. The first man-made object to be put into orbit was Russian, the Sputnik 1 satellite back in 1957. America, shocked at being beaten into space, vowed to go one better and created NASA. The space race was on. And now, little more than a decade after that first Sputnik, man is on the brink of his greatest achievement, landing on the moon. Now, while the astronauts can only hope that they'll make the record books, their space rocket is already in there. As Andrea said, the Saturn V rocket is an amazing piece of engineering. It's broken virtually every record out there. It's the largest and most powerful launch vehicle ever successfully used for space exploration. With the Apollo 11 spacecraft on top, Saturn V measures 363 feet, or 111 meters, just 2 feet lower than St. Paul's Cathedral. As it waits on the launch pad, fully fueled, it weighs 6.5 million pounds. That's a lot of weight to lift off, but much of it is fuel, either rocket fuel or liquid oxygen and hydrogen mixed. It's contained in what are called the 3 stages of the Saturn V rocket, each one responsible for a different part of the astronaut's journey. The first stage has fuel for just 2.5 minutes of flight. But that's enough time for the rocket to reach an altitude of 42 miles and a speed in excess of 6,000 miles an hour. At this point, the first stage of Saturn V, called the S1C, has served its purpose and will separate from the rest of the rocket. Now, the second part of the rocket will take over, thrusting the Apollo spacecraft through the upper atmosphere, and its engines burning for little more than 2 minutes. Finally, the third stage will fire up, putting the spacecraft into orbit around the Earth. And if all this goes according to plan, America will be on the brink of a feat that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago.
Thanks, Peter. An idea there of what to watch out for tomorrow. But earlier today, the men who will be perched on top of that rocket spoke about the challenges ahead. This is what Buzz Aldrin had to say on the public's feelings about the mission to the moon.
I feel that we're seeing about the type of reaction that many of us were hoping for, and that is a very enthusiastic public that has great confidence in what our nation stands for and what our space program's aims have been, and what we hope to carry out in a few days for that American public.
Well, as Buzz said, in a few days' time, if the mission is successful, man will walk on the moon. His colleague Neil Armstrong has been picked to be the first to step onto the lunar surface. So what might his first words be?
Well, certainly nothing has been prepared for me, and our attention during the training period and up till now has been focused on how to do the job and how to do it best, and not so much with what might be the emotions of the moment. I think that would be impossible to predict, and so I do not plan to guess at this point what my emotions might dictate, if anything. As a matter of fact, I think perhaps the highlight for those of us in the LEM will probably be a successful touchdown. I really look forward to that the most this time.
Well, before Neil Armstrong has to decide what to say, there's the small matter of liftoff. We'll have full coverage of all the day's momentous events on tomorrow's programme. One last look tonight at the site of the Saturn V rocket standing ready on the launch pad. Tomorrow it will blast off, carrying its precious cargo. Destination, the moon. Good night, and thanks for watching.
So John Suchet reports on Apollo 11's launch as the astronauts begin their journey to the moon. Lift off tomorrow night at 10:35.
Good evening. It's July the 16th, 1969. Truly a date for the history books. Around the world, excitement and anticipation are building, nowhere more so than at the Kennedy Space Center. When Apollo 11 blasts off into space, hundreds of millions of people are expected to watch on live TV. It's estimated that 1 million alone are watching on the beaches and roads around the Space Center. This is the scene today in Florida. The experts say weather conditions are very good with low wind speeds and high cloud. So nothing should halt today's countdown bar any last-minute technical glitches. We'll be able to hear what the astronauts and NASA have to say throughout the vital minutes of liftoff. We'll be listening into that in just a few moments. But first, our Apollo correspondent, Andrea Catherwood, reports on the build-up to an incredible journey.
As morning broke, the Saturn V rocket was standing on the launch pad, ready for its journey into the unknown. The astronauts were already awake, woken at 4 a.m. local time, for a breakfast of orange juice, steak, scrambled eggs and coffee. Then it was down to the business of the day, suiting up, last-minute medical examinations, final checks, and perhaps a moment to reflect for the three men. Then a quick walk and time to wave goodbye to the crowds outside as the crew began an 8-mile journey to the launch pad, their last earthbound journey for a while.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control, T-minus 2 hours, 40 minutes, 40 seconds, and counting. At this time, the prime crew for Apollo 11 has boarded the high-speed elevator. The spacecraft commander, Neil Armstrong, and CMP, the command module pilot, Mike Collins, now standing by in the White Room.
Far below them, the men and women of NASA who will guide them on their way.
The vehicle starting to pressurize as far as the propellant tanks are concerned, and all is still go as we monitor our status for it. Firing command coming in now. We're on an automatic sequence as the master computer supervises hundreds of events occurring over these last few minutes.
NASA's cameras are capturing every second of the countdown. So with less than 2 minutes until liftoff, let's go over to the Apollo Launch Control at the Kennedy Space Center.
T-minus 1 minute, 35 seconds on the Apollo mission, the flight to land of the first men on the moon. All indications coming in to the control center at this time indicate we are go. 1 minute, 25 seconds and counting. Our status for it indicates the third stage completely pressurized. 80-second mark has now been passed. We'll go on full internal power at the 50-second mark in the countdown. Guidance system goes on internal at 17 seconds, leading up to the ignition sequence at 8.9 seconds. We're approaching the 60-second mark on the Apollo 11 mission. T-minus 60 seconds and counting. We passed T-minus 60. 55 seconds and counting. Neil Armstrong just reported back. It's been a real smooth countdown. We passed the 50-second mark. Power transfer is complete. We're on internal power with the launch vehicle at this time. 40 seconds away from the Apollo 11 liftoff. All the second stage tanks now pressurized. 35 seconds and counting. We are still go with Apollo 11. 30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
Okay, we got a roll program.
Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading.
You're watching the amazing sight of the Saturn V rocket blasting into space as the Apollo 11 spacecraft lifts off on its mission to the moon.
Roll is complete and the pitch is programmed. One Bravo.
One Bravo is a abort control mode. Altitude's 2 miles.
Oh, 11 Houston, you're good at 1 minute.
Downrange 1 mile, altitude 4 miles now. Velocity 2,195 feet per second.
Truly an amazing sight. Let's get some reaction now. Over to the astronomer Patrick Moore, who you'll recognise from the BBC's Sky at Night. Patrick, let's take another look at those incredible pictures. The Apollo 11 mission really has just been one outstanding achievement after another.
It has indeed, and so far everything has gone according to plan. No reason now why it shouldn't go on going according to plan. That was a great lift-off.
Let's hope so. And Patrick, the 3 Apollo 11 astronauts have, of course, been preparing for this for a very long time. But it's really impossible to know what to expect, isn't it?
It is, and of course you can't really simulate it. You actually got to do it. Now, they have been in space before, these 3, so they know what to expect. But this is only the start. There's a long, long way to go, 250,000 miles.
Certainly a long journey ahead in space. But back on Earth, Patrick, hundreds of people working together for what is a mammoth effort by NASA, isn't it?
It is indeed, and of course, every component has got to work perfectly. Because one tiny failure, one piece of equipment, and the entire thing can go very badly wrong. So let's hope that doesn't happen. There's no reason why it should.
I'm sure. Thanks very much, Patrick. Well, it has been a day of dramatic scenes, but take a look at these pictures which have just reached us. They were filmed as the rocket flew up into orbit less than 3 minutes after liftoff, and already you can clearly see the curvature of the Earth. It's the moment the first stage of the Saturn V rocket was jettisoned and left to fall back into the Atlantic Ocean. Tomorrow, there will be more from the astronauts on their 3-day journey to the moon. I'll be back then, but I'll leave you with this amazing image from space. Good night.
Mission to the moon continues tomorrow.
Good evening. It's July the 17th, 1969, day 2 of NASA's mission into the history books. Up in space, the astronauts have travelled so far, they're already closer to the moon than to Earth, around 150,000 miles away from us down here and moving at an incredible 3,000 miles an hour. If all goes to plan, that means we are on schedule for the moon landing on July the 20th. This morning, Houston Mission Control gave the astronauts an update on the big news stories here on Earth. And as you'd expect, top of the list was Apollo 11 and their spectacular liftoff from Florida yesterday. In the last few moments, they've begun a TV transmission. So what's the view of Earth like from space?
We're seeing the center of the Earth viewed from the spacecraft in the eastern Pacific Ocean, but we can clearly see the western coast of North America, Mexico down as far as Acapulco, and you can see on through Central America.
So, a chance for the astronauts to do some sightseeing from their spacecraft. They're travelling in what's called the Command Service Module, and this tin can will be their cramped living quarters over the next few days. Here's Peter Snow to take a closer look at the module and its journey to the moon.
Well, John, let's go back to those first moments just after liftoff and still 3 days' travel from the moon. The astronauts were already preparing for the lunar landing. They were in low Earth orbit for just 2.5 hours before the final stage of the Saturn V rocket was ignited for a second time to give the spacecraft enough speed to leave behind the Earth's gravitational pull and begin the journey to the moon. Right now, they're still on that journey, and the next step will come in 2 days' time, when the astronauts will fire an engine to shift their spacecraft into lunar orbit. Then it's almost time for the astronauts to split up. The Command Service Module, nicknamed Columbia, will stay in orbit for the duration of the moon landing. The pilot, Michael Collins, will be the astronaut who stays behind. As its name implies, the Command Service Module is divided into 2 main parts. The Service Module provides power and storage space, and this part of the spacecraft will be jettisoned and left to burn up in the atmosphere as the Command Module begins its final journey home. The Command Module is just 10 feet 7 inches, or about 3 meters tall. This is life-size. It's the vehicle which will carry the astronauts back to Earth. Now take a look inside. Pretty cramped for 3 strapping astronauts. And this tiny capsule will be the only part of the Saturn V rocket and Apollo 11 spacecraft not to be discarded along the way. It's basically a cone shape, and this shape is vitally important to keep the capsule aerodynamically stable as it falls to Earth blunt end first. Now that means only that end, the blunt end, needs a heat shield. Friction with the Earth's atmosphere will take the external temperature to almost 3,000 degrees centigrade. That's half the temperature of the sun's surface. But that moment is still many days off. First, we must wait to see if the astronauts can complete their mission to the moon.
Thanks, Peter. Well, Columbia may be cramped, but it's the astronaut's spacesuit, which has been described as the smallest spaceship in the world, and it's just as vital for his survival. Our science editor, Peter Fairley, has been finding out how the kit and the lunar module, which will hopefully take 2 astronauts to the moon's surface, will help them on their mission.
I'm wearing the full lunar suit, except the helmet, including I'm wearing what have been nicknamed the lunar galoshes, which are special overshoes, specially insulated to keep the astronaut's feet cool while he walks on the surface of the moon, where the temperature at times can become hot enough to melt lead. Underneath the lunar bug is the main descent engine, which slows it down from a speed originally of about 3,000 miles an hour to a mere 5 or 10 miles an hour for the landing. Underneath here also is the landing radar. It tells the lunanauts how close to the moon they've come. The base of the moonship houses fuel tanks, batteries, cooling equipment, and also the tools that the lunanauts will use on the surface of the moon. And here is the moon toolkit. It includes the lunar tongs, the moon hammer, and the moon shovel. Lunar bug's been called a daddy long legs for obvious reasons, but the interesting thing about its legs are that they have their own built-in shock absorbers. But the interesting thing is that below them, as it comes into land, will project steel rods 5 feet long. The purpose of these is to touch the moon first and tell the moonship's main engine when to switch off. That last free drop of 5 feet is going to be crucial, because on Earth it takes 400 people to launch a rocket from a specially constructed flat firing pad. On the moon, the 2 men have got to do it themselves, and so they've got to land on an even keel and not on a tilt. Well, I'm sweating a bit, and I expect they will be when the moment comes. Peter Fairley, ITN, from the simulated surface of the moon.
Well, as the astronauts glide through space, back home, among the millions watching their amazing journey, are a small group who are following it just that little more closely than most. Amazingly, the astronauts' wives have been given special communications equipment so they can listen in to NASA and the spacecraft 24 hours a day. Well, a short time ago, Buzz Aldrin's wife, Joan, spoke about her feelings.
Mrs. Aldrin, what is your reaction to the flight so far?
I'm excited, of course, and very tense.
What was the emotion in the house when the rocket blasted off?
Things were really very quiet. There was a lot of emotion going on, but there were no screams, no yells, just very quiet.
Mrs. Aldrin, you say you're very tense. Your husband obviously discussed the flight with you in detail. Which part of the flight are you most tense about?
Well, wouldn't you know the answer to that one? It will be Monday morning.
Mrs. Aldrin, do you have a squawk box in your house?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Are you going to keep it on all the time?
Probably, as long as I can understand it.
Proud lady. Well, during these programs, we hope to answer many of your questions about this mission. And if you ever wondered, how do you shave in zero gravity? Well, here's the answer. Mike Collins obviously wants to look his best for the cameras. NASA, by the way, spent thousands of dollars developing an electric razor with an attached vacuum cleaner before they discovered that a simple aerosol shaving foam worked best. Well, the latest update from NASA has reported that everything is on track for the moon landing. For now, though, good night and thanks for watching. Good evening, it's July the 19th, 1969, and all being well, this time tomorrow, man will have landed on the moon. So as we get ever closer to that moment, the astronauts are busy doing their final checks. For 3 days now, the crew of Apollo 11 have enjoyed views like this. Extraordinary views. Looking back to Earth, seeing the world they have left behind. But each hour the moon has come ever closer. And just a few hours ago, the spacecraft passed behind the moon, briefly cutting off radio contact. It was a nerve-wracking moment. But the latest from NASA is that all systems are go. Well, communications with space aren't always that clear. But a short while ago, the 3 astronauts still sounded pretty light-hearted.
We're about to open the hatch now. Right. That same guy that when you open up the doorway, he's waiting there for you and he turns the lights on. How about that? It's like the refrigerator. Hey, that's a great shot right there. We see you in there. Guess that's Neil and Mike. Better be, anyway. The vehicle is surprisingly free of any debris floating around. It's very clean. Roger. Levin, you said it's pretty hard to describe this view. It's really, really great. Now you know how we feel. I'm unable to determine altitude at all looking out the window. I couldn't tell whether we're down at 60 or up at 170. I bet you could tell if you were down at 50,000 feet. I wouldn't be surprised.
So the checks are almost complete. The astronauts prepared for their next historic step. But what about the lunar module, which will take the astronauts, hopefully, to the moon? Peter's here to have a closer look now at a spacecraft which is truly one of a kind.
Meet the lunar module, John, known to the astronauts as the LEM, and more informally, they call it Eagle. Now, it looks like no spaceship ever built, and that's because it's been designed without a thought for aerodynamics. Because, of course, on and near the moon, there's no air. This lunar lander has 1 million parts, and it costs £30 million. But despite its cost and size, about the height of a double-decker bus, it's much bigger than this model here, it weighs just 4 tons. And that's because it's made entirely out of aluminium or aluminium alloy. In places, the skin of the spacecraft is nothing more than a few layers of silver foil, and all that foil has led to the nickname of the Flying Chocolate Box. Well, it's just a matter of hours now before 2 astronauts, the pilot Buzz Aldrin and Commander Neil Armstrong, will fly down to the surface of the moon. And they'll fly the Eagle while standing up. The designers say seats add unnecessary weight. Of course, lunar landing techniques are still in their infancy, and the objective of the Apollo 11 crew is to reach the surface of the moon safely. As with everything on this mission, a potential landing area has already been scouted out by earlier missions, and the proposed site is the Southern Sea of Tranquility. It's been chosen because it's relatively flat and smooth. And with just hours to go until the critical moment of landing, it'll be nail-bitingly exciting to see if the 2 astronauts can touch down there gently and safely on the moon.
Thanks, Peter. And I can talk now to astronomer Patrick Moore, who you will recognise from the BBC's Sky at Night programme. Well, Patrick, as Peter said, it's just a matter of hours until the lunar mission begins. What will the astronauts be doing now?
Well, when Armstrong and Aldrin actually go down, first of all, they've got to make absolutely certain all their equipment's functioning perfectly, their space suits and everything else. Because one tiny failure you can't put right. But of course, it all depends on coming down safely. If they come down at a sharp angle, then the situation is very difficult indeed. So they've got to be very, very careful. The landing should be automatic, but just in case they're coming through a dangerous area, Armstrong could take over manually.
Right, now you've been closely involved in the work to map the moon's surface. What have you had to do?
Well, you've got to have moon maps, obviously. We had to work out what the best places. We selected, as you know, an area on the Sea of Tranquility, because it's as level as any part of the moon. There are no high mountains there, and it looks pretty firm, because the one thing we don't really know yet is how firm the surface is, and this is the main danger.
Right, and assuming they do make it to the moon, what will they do on the surface?
When they land on the moon, they'll go out for what they call a moonwalk, and that'll be one of the testing times. They'll find out, take samples to start with, and then they'll put up various pieces of equipment to be left there, which will go on functioning when the astronauts have left the moon. So the journey will then be over, but the results will not. They'll keep on coming in.
Now, Patrick, I must ask you, what now for the space race between Russia and the United States?
Well, NASA has won the space race. The Russians have given up their efforts to put a man on the moon for the time being, so it'll be a question of consolidation. There should be several more Apollos, but I don't think the Russians are going to join in yet.
OK, now what part of the mission, Patrick, are you most excited or even nervous about?
To me, I think two. First of all, a successful landing. And secondly, the takeoff when they finally leave the moon, because they have one ascent engine, and that's got to work properly first time.
It's almost within reach. In less than 24 hours' time, if all goes according to plan, mankind will make history by stepping onto the surface of the moon. John F. Kennedy challenged his nation to make it there before the end of the 60s.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
But as the astronauts soar over the moon, it'll be another American president who sits in the White House watching to see if that dream can be fulfilled. And Richard Nixon won't be the only one glued to his television set. Tomorrow, a record TV audience is expected to tune in. I'll be back to bring you every moment, every picture from what could be the most momentous day in human history. Until then, good night and thank you for watching.
Good evening from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, launch pad of the greatest space mission there has ever been. And tonight, 40 years after he left the footprint of history on the surface of the moon, Neil Armstrong has been meeting President Obama. The legacy of Apollo 11 has been remembered around the world and above it. These are live pictures of the International Space Station more than 200 miles up, where between spacewalks they've been talking about how Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin inspired their generation of astronauts. 13 are packed in there at the moment, a record. Well, back down here on Earth, not much has been seen of Neil Armstrong in the last 40 years. After walking on the moon, he became the most famous person on the planet. Since then, he's largely retreated from the limelight. But this private man has returned to public view for the 40th anniversary. Robert Moore reports on President Obama's meeting with the first man on the moon.
Three iconic figures, three genuine American heroes.
For a few minutes today, the Apollo 11 crew were together again. This time not crammed in a capsule, but in the spacious Oval Office. The president issued a challenge to NASA. Be ready for their successors.
We expect that there's, as we speak, another generation of kids out there who are looking up at the sky and are going to be the next Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrins, and we want to make sure that NASA is going to be there for them.
Neil Armstrong was the mission commander, the fearless test pilot. His first steps on the moon turned him into the most famous man on Earth.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But since his touchdown and those thrilling July days in 1969, Armstrong has retreated into his own world, rarely speaking about the Apollo missions, avoiding politics and publicity. Stepping out of the shadows, he is cryptic, enigmatic, refusing to talk about the future of space exploration.
History is a sequence of random events and unpredictable choices, which is why the future is so difficult to foresee. But you can try.
This was Neil Armstrong in 1969 practicing his moon landing. Images that capture his buccaneering spirit. It looks like science fiction. Actually, he's about to crash, but for him, It's just another narrow escape. In space, he was in his element, calm and resourceful. On Earth, Armstrong kept to himself, perhaps overwhelmed by his fame. On his return, he recalled the plaque he left at the moon landing site.
Perhaps in the third millennia, a wayward stranger will read that plaque at Tranquility Base.
Armstrong has always been the quiet one, and even now he is not joining the great debate on the future of NASA. He's leaving it to others to decide whether going back to the moon is even worthwhile, or whether getting a man on Mars is a more appropriate, more inspirational mission. But all the while, it is the taciturn Armstrong who sets the standard for the next generation of space explorers. Robert Moore, News at 10, in Washington.
Well, as we've been hearing, Buzz Aldrin walked the walk with Neil Armstrong back in 1969. Unlike Armstrong, though, he's still more than happy to talk the talk. He says the future for manned spaceflight should be Mars. As I discovered when I met him, he's still buzzing 40 years on from the ultimate high.
Good luck and Godspeed.
Looking out and seeing the sunrise over the Atlantic Ocean, the waves slowly coming in, no sounds at all.
We are still go with Apollo.
And off in the distance, I could see the evidence of people 3, 4, 5 miles away, just masses of people.
Ignition sequence start. 6.
This is so peaceful and serene, and it's going to change pretty quick.
It remains today one of the pinnacles of human achievement. Just 8 years earlier, President Kennedy had promised to put man on the moon. Yet up until the very last moment, it almost didn't happen. As Neil Armstrong looked for a place to land, Buzz Aldrin realised they only had 20 seconds worth of fuel left. You must have wanted to turn to him saying, good heavens, can we just get this thing down now? The fuel is almost gone.
It crossed my mind that I best not disturb his attention. He's concentrating. I'm going to give him information. I really don't dare look out the window, really, out my front window, until right near the very last minute. I looked out and I saw the shadow of the rear landing gear, and we got to be close. By that time, I felt pretty confident.
The Eagle has landed.
But it was a mind-blowing moment. Alongside all the science,
it was mind-blowing, but we couldn't afford to get wrapped up in any kind of celebration because it's a long ways back home.
Okay, I'm going to leave that 1 foot up there and both hands down about the 4th rung up. There you go.
After those hours waiting, making the preparations inside Eagle, you got to step out yourself. What did it smell like? What did it look like? What are your vivid memories of the moon?
Lifeless, totally lifeless, still, black sky, shades of gray depending on the sun angle, and the sunlight is going to be there for 13 and a half days, and then it's going to be dark for 13 and a half days, get very, very cold, radiation from the sun, no oxygen. This is not a very hospitable place.
What did you contemplate when you looked at the Earth?
Well, I'm glad it's there, and and they know where we are.
2.5 hours later, and their moonwalk was over. NASA and the Earth were calling them home. Heroes and pioneers of a new space age. But as an individual, Buzz Aldrin had nothing else to aim for.
I didn't know what really to do about it. And that's sort of dismal after you've been so structured and so goal-oriented in your life to have a realization that you're just not sure what it's all about in your future.
And neither, in his eyes, did NASA.
The transition from one program to another is very difficult. We're in the midst of transitioning from the shuttle and space station era with great investments on our nation's part, and we're going back into exploration, and I think we're having some difficulties in defining exactly how we do that. Very few things in government and in bureaucracies want to see change come about. This president ran his campaign on change. Now he has a wonderful opportunity to make enlightened changes.
The amazing Buzz Aldrin, whom I had the pleasure of meeting. And as we saw earlier, the work of the shuttle continues in orbit as we speak. It's on a 16-day mission and will include 5 spacewalks, one of which is continuing while we're on air tonight. Earlier, one of the current crop of astronauts, Bob Thirsk, gave himself, what else? A buzz cut, using a special razor with a vacuum cleaner attached. It stops, apparently, the bits of hair floating around the space station. Well, to get a sense of what that first moonwalk meant back down on Earth, we've been asking some of the most famous names of the time what they remember about the 20th of July 1969. Here's what they told us about their moon memories.
There was a real buzz, I think, around the world, and a surprising number of people had stayed up right through to the end of the moonwalk, and there was a great sort of euphoria in the studio, and we were all felt delighted and almost honoured to have been there for this mega event. To have been there as part of that event was a real excitement. It was a real privilege.
We had planned, Alexander, my husband and I, planned to have dinner outside on the terrace there, with a television set to the left, and the moon up above. And it was a wonderful summer night. And to have dinner there, watching both the television of the landing and the real moon there on the terrace on a blissful night. And it was. What an excitement. It opened up a whole new era of possibilities.
And it was a brilliant feel. It was a feel that we could do anything. Anybody could do anything, and we were doing it. And the whole of the 60s, it really was an exciting time. Apart from the fact all girls were wearing miniskirts and they all seemed to be fabulous, there was this feeling of liberation and that you could do anything. And then suddenly we were walking on the moon. And remember that it almost like epitomized and fulfilled everything that was happening in the 60s. Great time, great moment.
I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene.
Tomorrow, the memories of a musician, a newscaster and an intrepid explorer, but still ahead on tonight's News at 10. A trip back in time, but what's the connection between the first man on the moon and a picture postcard small town in Scotland?
Plus all the sports headlines, including anger from David Beckham and...
Outside agent. Reflect the history of the day. Florida Today reports on last night's astronauts lecture and says the Apollo 11 crew is now looking to the future of space exploration to Mars. And USA Today also reports that Neil Armstrong called the space race in the 60s the ultimate peaceful competition. And finally, the 40th anniversary is being remembered 4,000 miles from here in the Scottish borders town of Langham. The Armstrong clan have their ancestral roots there, and the most famous Armstrong in the world paid a visit at the height of his fame. Emma Murphy has been hearing from the townsfolk who met the local hero.
He was one of the world's most famous men, and yet in 1972 Neil Armstrong visited the tiny borders town of Langham.
Mrs. Wilkie. How do you do?
The town council invited him to the historic seat of the Armstrong clan to make him freeman of the borough. Such was the clamour to see Armstrong, the service took place in the local church. It was the only place big enough to house so many people.
I now hereby admit you, Neil Alden Armstrong, as a freeman and honorary burgess of the borough of Langham.
My pleasure in calling this a hometown is the genuine feeling that I have among these hills, and more particularly among these people.
Grace Brown wrote the original letter of invitation.
We couldn't see how a man who had walked in on the moon would want to come to a sleepy little town like Langham. But we were quite touched that a man who had done such a great thing as walking on the moon was actually talking about Langham as his hometown.
Alec Poole was in the welcoming procession and was one of those who met Neil Armstrong.
He was a very pleasant, very quiet-spoken, almost humble type of man, you would say, in spite of his achievement. Wonderful man. He made a great impression to everybody here in Langham.
Tales of Neil Armstrong's visit have been passed down through the generations. Young and old can now stand outside at night and look at the moon and say that once upon a time, a man who walked on the moon also walked through their town. Emma Murphy, News at 10, Langham.
And that is tonight's News at 10. Coming up, the weather, the news from your part of the UK, and then the news from 1969, how the events on the moon were reported. But now from Mark in London and the team here at the Kennedy Space Centre, good night. Man's first landing on the moon. And Apollo's successor, the Space Shuttle Endeavour, docked tonight with the International Space Station. But in a timely reminder of the dangers of space travel, NASA has decided to postpone all future shuttle flights until it's worked out why strips of insulating foam peeled off the fuel tank on launch.
It just kind of peeled off of the primer layer of the metal, and you can actually see the metal underneath it. It's not thick foam at all. It's the foam is about a ½ an inch thick, so it kind of came off in little sheets in about 7 or 8 different areas, and we don't understand why that actually happened.
Well, Endeavour took off from here almost 40 years to the day after the giant Saturn V rocket blasted off of the moon in 1969. It was carrying precious cargo, 3 American astronauts and the hopes and dreams of the whole world. On Wednesday, another 7 astronauts took off, but not to the moon this time. No one's been back there since 1972. Well, behind me here are just some of the reminders of the feat of engineering that made the lunar landings possible. For more than 4 decades, this vast Florida plain and thousands of well-wishers have witnessed the start of each space mission. However, the public are kept well back. It's extremely rare to be allowed near the actual launch site. But for this 40th anniversary of man landing on the moon, I was given special access along with NBC's space correspondent Jay Barbary, who's covered every manned launch since 1969. We're allowed close up to the gateway to the moon. It's the place where man leapt from the Earth to the moon. Close up, it still has the power to amaze. This is the spot where a dream was realised and history was made. Jay Barbary, who's covered every American space mission, showed us around.
This is the main ramp going up to the launch pad. The astronauts had gotten into their spacesuits over at the astronaut quarters. Riding in their astronaut van, they came up here, stopped at the bottom, got on the elevator, went more than 300 feet up to where Apollo 11 was and boarded that spacecraft. They were already 363 feet off the ground when they started their 240,000-mile journey to the moon.
And this is the point at which the Earth shook.
Right here. And they had all of this power, 7.5 million pounds of thrust. And when it left, it would just jar you. It would shake the skin literally on your body.
And it's still a working launch pad today with the liftoff of the shuttle Endeavour here just 2 days ago.
And liftoff of Endeavour.
It still draws the crowds too, with people stopping for miles around to focus on this very spot, exactly as they did back on that July night in 1969.
It had to be 3 miles back for safety, but what you see over here is the flame trench. You see this water tower up here. It dumps all of this water, thousands of gallons on it, underneath these fiery rockets when they ignite. Now that's 7.5 million pounds of thrust, because that thing was enormous. It was heavier than a battleship going up.
Moving the Saturn V rocket to the launch pad was a feat in itself, inched along a 3-mile track. So Jay, this piece of machinery shifts the rocket onto the launch pad.
Yes, it's called the crawler transporter. It's huge, and as you can see, these big tracks here, they move only about 1/4 mile per hour. Can go as fast as 1 mile per hour if they need to, but it's 3 miles out here from the vertical assembly building, and it takes them 6 hours to bring the rocket or a shuttle to the launch pad, and that's the same amount of time it took for Apollo 11.
Launchpad 39A still points the way to the moon, even though no one has been there since 1972. NASA is at last making plans to return. What's needed now, though, is the political will to push open once again our gateway to another planet. Charlie Duke was Capcom as capsule communicator, the only person allowed to talk to the astronauts. His southern drawl providing a reassuringly calm commentary to those historic TV pictures. But when I spoke to the voice of NASA, Charlie told me just how tense it was in the final moments before touchdown.
It certainly was. In mission control, it's a hubbub of activity normally. And as we got closer to landing and the fuel state became critical, things got very, very quiet and the tension was mounting, and we were very anxious. Were we going to make it? The thought going through my mind, you know, we're getting really, really critical. When Neil came back, he said, Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed. And we were so excited, at least I was. I responded, Roger, twang, and I said Twanquility instead of Tranquility.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
And a few years later, you got to go to the moon yourself. You're one of the 12 who has stood on the moon.
As I stepped onto the surface, it was almost an overwhelming feeling of wonder. It was just, you know, I'm on the moon and in this beautiful, magnificent place. And and nobody had ever been here before. It was that kind of emotional high. You don't feel the lunar surface. You got all your suit on and your moon boots. So it's not like walking on the beach here where you can feel the give. We didn't have that feeling on the moon, but your emotions are just out of sight, you know, with the wonder and the excitement, the adventure.
On this extraordinary anniversary, what are your thoughts 40 years on?
You know, we're all getting old, and everybody's in their 70s now. Some have passed on that were involved in Apollo. So who knows whether this will be the last big anniversary that we'll be able to celebrate together. So we all want to participate, and we're very thankful for it.